Greetings. So, this is going to be our final installment in our mental health and combat trauma unit. Next week, we're going to be moving on to something else. So, in review, we've talked about PTSD already, and we talked about more generally just the medicalization of combat trauma. And we talked about Sigmund Freud and his attempts to make sense out of things like guilt and how guilt manifests in people who participate in all kinds of war. In the reading that I assigned to you, he was thinking about indigenous peoples and the way that indigenous peoples experience guilt in war. Last week, we started our discussion on this concept of moral injury. We talked about how the theory of moral injury grew out of the work of Dr. Jonathan Shay, who was working as a physician at a veterans center in Boston, Massachusetts. Most of Shay's patients were Vietnam War veterans, and Shay observed with his patients that the DSM's listing on PTSD just didn't really capture the experience, the kinds of experiences that were being described to him by his patients. So Shay described moral injury, this term that he coined, moral injury, as a kind of suffering that results, in his framing, basically due to institutional failure and the waging of war in ways that are socially understood to be as incorrect, particularly by authority figures, people in positions of authority, people like commanders or politicians. Later, this term came back in the 21st century when it was raised by some clinicians who were working with veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was remobilized in a way that framed moral injury as something that describes more of an experience of individual guilt, basically saying that moral injury occurs to combatants who are doing things themselves that they as individuals believe to be wrong. So this week, I had you read something a little bit different. I had you read a piece by Ken McLeish, and McLeish is approaching the subject of moral injury kind of as more of a theoretical object. So I admit that the writing in this piece might be a little more dense than some of the things I've been assigning to you so far. It's a theoretical work, so if it's a little bit harder to understand, I recognize that. And I'll try to distill the things that I really want you to take from it here. So, Ken McLeish, he's a medical anthropologist who works at Vanderbilt in Tennessee. And McLeish did his initial anthropological field work with soldiers at Fort Hood in Texas. And he published a book a few years ago about this and about Fort Hood. And if you've been watching the news these days, Fort Hood's been in the news a lot for a number of reasons. But today, McLeish is concerned with trauma discourse and what, for our discussion today, we're going to refer to as the work that is done by trauma diagnoses, sort of the social work. So, starting with the article, what do we get from it from the very, very beginning? We do see pretty early on that McLeish seems to be skeptical. He seems to have some questions about the moral injury phenomena and trying to understand what it is doing. So he says, and I quote, I argue that moral injury theory represents an effort to carve out a distinct domain of psychological expertise, but also a negotiation of the tension between war violence's normal practice and its excessive or morally hazardous manifestations, both of which link mental illness directly to the politics of war violence and post-war care. He also says moral injury valorizes war fighting and military culture while casting war as a source of almost inevitable psychopathology. End quote. So what does that mean? Well, this is pretty relevant to our class. McLeish is kind of going straight at the relationship between war and society. He's saying that the moral injury label Maybe it has a little bit less to do with trying to describe and treat an experience of suffering by soldiers, and maybe it has more to do with society and trying to negotiate society's relationship to war. So now, if we go back in time a little bit, to some things we talked about earlier in the semester, we already looked at how the PTSD diagnosis itself did some social work, some of these same kinds of things. PTSD was a diagnosis of symptoms, but it was also an object that was negotiated by several different parties with diverse and sometimes contradictory interests. And some people might argue that PTSD emerged partially, you might say, as kind of a way to maybe pass the buck a little bit on war atrocities and things like that. I'm not saying that's what you're supposed to believe, but there are people who will make that argument. McLeish is bringing a similar kind of argument to the moral injury phenomena, and he's asking us, what is moral injury doing? How is moral injury telling us as a society to relate to and understand war and the things that happen at war and the people who fight in wars? So in the early part of the article, or the very beginning, McLeish opens up with an event. And the event is that of an American Marine killing an Iraqi child. Again, McLeish states in the article that he's not arguing that the suffering experienced by these people is not real. But how does this moral injury phenomena tell us to process an event such as this one? This event of this Marine killing an Iraqi child. So, one of the major arguments made by McLeish in this article is that moral injury is doing something similar to what PTSD did after Vietnam. To put it bluntly, McLeish is asking if there's some sort of agency, if there's some sort of socio-political aim that's achieved by framing war violence, let's say in this context, that of an expeditionary war waged by the United States, say in somewhere like Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam. Is there some sort of socio-political aim that's achieved by framing the vast and terrible violence of these wars in such a way that generally convinces the American public that the most significant victims of that war violence are the American soldiers themselves who are fighting in the war, and particularly the psyches of these soldiers? So what's the other major question or argument that's raised by McLeish in this piece? Well, since some of the work that's described above, what I just said, is similarly accomplished by the PTSD diagnosis, and we saw some of that happening after outcry about war atrocities during and after the Vietnam War. What is the social role that is accomplished by having moral injury? Something that's different. Okay, so we talked about how in a clinical context, the need for moral injury developed in a clinical context due to the fact that the PTSD diagnosis was not accounting for all of the veterans' experiences. However, McLeish is asking us social questions here, not questions that are overtly clinical. He's asking what social roles do these things fulfill. So if moral injury needed to happen in the clinic to account for experiences not accounted for by PTSD, then what social role is being filled by moral injury that was not being filled by the PTSD diagnosis? So a word that we see McLeish using in this piece is profound. And this is meaningful. It is noted by some of the clinicians and theorists that are cited by McLeish in this piece. Some people have been frustrated with the sterility, how sterile the PTSD diagnosis is. It's very medical, and that was built into it. It was created to be a very sterile and biomedical diagnosis that served some purposes that we've talked about already. And it has a kind of non-poetic nature to it. PTSD is a disease. It's subject to stigma, and it turns its sufferers into mental patients. Moral injury, however, moves the disruption that occurred, the disruption that caused this ailment. It moves this into the field of ethics, into the soul. And this is something that was being overtly avoided when the PTSD diagnosis was being developed after the Vietnam War. They were saying, how can we process all these things in a way that has nothing to do with ethics or the soul? It's all about biological experience and fear and things like that. And that's what resulted in this more sterile PTSD diagnosis. But now we're having to account for some of that. There's some social work that's not being accomplished by the fact that the PTSD diagnosis is sterile, among other things. So this is where PTSD, or where moral injury can do something that PTSD cannot. For example, PTSD, because of the way that it was developed in the DSM, PTSD has become something that is actually relatable to a large segment of the public. A lot of people in our society have been diagnosed with PTSD. A lot of civilians have been diagnosed with PTSD and have experienced this due to a large range of traumas, a very diverse range of just very terrible things that people in our society have had to endure. And people have received the PTSD diagnosis to account for the suffering that they're experiencing after these traumas. However, moral injury kind of gives us this maybe more poetic, more profound arena within which we can consider the injuring of the soldier psyche. We can place the soldier psyche on a higher plane of experience. And now this affliction that we're talking about is something that's not only real, but now maybe it's beyond the conception of average citizens. So if we go back to the case that McLeish cites at the beginning of this piece, the case of the American Marine who killed an Iraqi child and was later suffering because of it, PTSD cannot really account for that experience, but maybe that experience is the thing that is most troubling to that Marine in their current civilian life. This suffering is not due to something like surviving a bomb blast or an ambush. This suffering is due to having killed an innocent child. So this person comes home, and maybe the public isn't happy about this. He's not happy. The public's not happy about it. I mean, we do have we do have some cruel and xenophobic and racist people in our society who might not feel very bad about that having happened. But let's say that many, if not most, people in our society are going to struggle with the ethics of that, at least a little bit. Are we going to support a war where we send our warriors overseas to kill children? Are we going to see this guy? We can see him now, this Marine, he's traumatized, he's not okay, but how are we supposed to feel about that? How are we supposed to feel about him? Are we able to have compassion for this person? Should we? Maybe we should just shut this war business down and stop going overseas to kill people. Well, the reality is that's not going to fly in our society, so we've got to do something about it. And due to the fact that the PTSD diagnosis isn't working for us to sweep war atrocities under the rug, we're going to have to do something else. And PTSD lacks that poetic character. It doesn't romanticize war enough. So now moral injury comes along, and that gives us something to work with here. McLeish argues that one of the roles of moral injury theory is the creation of an entirely separate moral sphere where these things are taking place. The realm of war is now imagined to be on a higher plane. The objects and decisions that are at stake in war are beyond the comprehension of civilians, and is actually a privileged place for the production of morality. In all of this, war and violence are being completely taken for granted. It's going to happen. The soldier is going to go to war. There's nothing that we can do about it, and we must assume that it is necessary. We have to think of the soldiers themselves as being fundamentally good, and thus the war that they're fighting in is fundamentally good. And the suffering that they are experiencing, this thing that we're calling moral injury, is the weight of their having to operate in the emotionally and psychologically taxing realm of war violence. This horrible burden that's been placed upon them. But it's actually a more profound kind of experience. Like I've said before, it's something that's happening on a higher plane, something above you. If you're a civilian and the security of your life is understood to be only secured by the actions of this martial class, who are making decisions that you cannot conceive of, you're not allowed to conceive of them, and they're having feelings that are beyond your limited capabilities and perceptions, can you judge them? Can you judge what these people do? Can you judge war? Maybe when you see footage of an American soldier shooting and killing a civilian, maybe your initial reaction can be, oh no, that's going to be really hard on that guy who just killed that civilian, rather than, oh no, that civilian's dead. That's terrible. And that was wrong. That shouldn't have happened. Also, another thing that's going on here is the intensive focus on soldier psyches as the object of our concern after war can simply be distracting to us. It can distract us from all these other things that are going on in war. Let's not talk about those things. Let's not talk about civilian deaths and collateral damage. Let's not talk about the military-industrial complex and an annual war budget that drains billions of dollars that could be used for social welfare. No, let's talk about the soldier psyche and the suffering that this particular group is experiencing. And let's focus exclusively on that, and let's do so in a way that frames these people as mythical superheroes who deserve our veneration. So that's sort of the concern that we're getting raised in this piece. So I know that this argument can be controversial. Like other things that I've assigned to you this semester, I'm not telling you that you have to buy this argument or that you have to agree with McLeish, but I am sharing it with you and trying to contextualize it for you and trying to make you aware of this argument that is being raised about moral injury, this phenomena that we've discussed, and that maybe gets at some of the nuts and bolts of things that we've been talking about throughout this whole unit on combat trauma. Framing combat trauma not just as this thing that happens when people go to war, but as the space where, at least in our current world, where the arenas of war and of society are kind of negotiating with each other and trying to figure out what reality is and how these two things are supposed to relate to each other, war and society. How do we understand each other? How do we figure out how we move forward? In the contemporary world, this realm of combat trauma, variously construed, is really one of the primary places where these negotiations are taking place. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to seeing you on Friday. Take care.